Since my first look CNC video, I've made a couple of changes. The most obvious is that we've now got a dust shoe. My shop vac hose didn't fit, so I had to make an adapter. I used PVC pipe and I renegotiated the diameter at each end by means of a heat gun. The second thing is that I've wired up a solid state relay so I can now control the router by software. Now, I didn't film that because I'm not an electrician, but I assure you I did earth it correctly. That's a matter of life and death, and I'll link below to a video that I used as a guide. Someone's asked about the software I use to create the G-code to control the CNC. Now, this is absolutely not suitable to be released to the general public, because as part of everyday operation I'll go in and change lines of code just to do a single job. It's written in Delphi, which is a fairly old programming language, and the version of Delphi I'm using is positively ancient. I generally start off a project by importing an image of, say, a template and then doing some digitizing with the mouse. As you can see, this accumulates a list of points with X and Y coordinates. I then rescale those points from raw mouse coordinates into project dimensions, millimeters, and divide them up into line segments, which I call paths. When those paths are displayed, at each point we also see a little blue line that's kind of at right angles to the main line. I call those normals, and they're going to be important later. I then create manually a series of toolpaths. Now, toolpaths are going to actually turn into instructions to tell the router what to do. And a toolpath takes a path, a line segment, and optionally offsets it by a certain amount and gives it a cutting depth. Now, the offsetting is quite often the radius of the cutting tool, because if we want to outline something, we have to cut a little bit outside based on the radius of the cutting tool, otherwise the piece is going to end up too small. Now, remember those little blue lines I mentioned earlier? It is in those directions that we offset the path when we generate the toolpath. So far so good, but if we want to do any contouring, you can now understand that by manually creating a series of toolpaths, a little bit offset, a little bit deeper, a little bit greater offset, a little bit deeper, more offset, deeper, that's a very tedious process, and it's fairly difficult to get a nice smooth curve. So I cooked up a new scheme that I call multipath. First up, I wrote a Python spill to generate a series of smooth mathematical curves using formulae. And I import those as a path. In the image you can see a couple of those curves at the bottom left of the bridge. Those curves are not going to be cut as toolpaths. Instead, they're going to be flipped up, as it were, and used as contour profiles. I use the X coordinate of those little curves as an offset, and I use the Y coordinate as the cutting depth, i.e. the Z. This allows one command to create a series of contours, one toolpath per point in that contour curve. Now, when we view all of those contouring toolpaths, the plot gets a little bit busy. So it's time to generate some G-code. I just press the button, and a few seconds later, there is the G-code. But there is absolutely no way I would load that up into the router and press go. I first need to visualize it to see if I've made any glaring errors. To do that, I downloaded Camiotics, a free open source CNC simulator. I load my generated G-code, specify a cutting tool diameter, and press go. This simulates the entire CNC run, showing me the toolpaths and the finished piece. I can then rotate and zoom and inspect that to see if I've made any silly mistakes. And if I'm not happy, I go back to the project, adjust it, regenerate the G-code, around and round in a cycle until I am. Then I load the G-code onto an SD card and pop it into this little controller. As I mentioned in the last video, the first few runs were very, very slow. Now, the two biggest problems is that I was too cautious with my feed speed and my maximum depth of cut. Another factor that I didn't notice at the time was that I was making far too many unnecessary passes, cutting off a tiny little bit while hogging material away and not taking full advantage of the cutting width of the diameter of the tool. There was also a problem of fuzziness in the pieces, especially in the areas where I was contouring across the grain. I'm suspecting that this is caused by the fact that I was contouring by cutting in from the side, butting in from the future. It turns out I was wrong. Cutting contours down from the top ends up making them a lot fuzzier than cutting them in from the side. So I made a few changes to my software and the project files so that they now have a faster feed speed, a deeper maximum depth of cut. We are skipping unnecessary passes while hogging away material above contours, just butting in here from the future. A couple of additional points of how I gain some performance gains. When I reach the end of cutting one path and I want to start cutting another, I now check to see whether the start point or the end point of that path is closest and start cutting from that end, backwards if need be. Which leads me to the second point. Normally in between tool paths that we cut, we raise the bit to a safe height, move to the next part and start cutting. But particularly when we are cutting contours, it makes most sense to just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But of course you have to be very, very sure that you don't need to raise the bit in between those segments. So let's fire it up and see if it makes a difference. So how do we go? I cut 3 today, tried out a few options, learnt a little bit about how to avoid the fuzzies, put a few new features into my software. This last one I cut took just a little over half an hour. That's down from 3 hours 20 minutes a couple of weeks ago. One issue is that with the increased feed rate, there's a few little unevennesses that I'm going to need to sand out, not quite as much as I'll need to get rid of all of these fuzzies. So I'll get busy with a bit of sandpaper, get right back.